The rain came over Aldenshaw from the west at 8 in the morning on the 11th of April, in the year 1819, in the flat grey sheets that the old men of that parish called a soaking, meaning a rain with no intention of stopping. It filled the ruts of the Ravensmere road, and it stood in the churchyard grass, and it came in under the north door of the schoolroom on the chantry piece, the way it had come in under that door for 130 years, and Clara Bray put the same folded sack against the same worn stone at 7:30 that she had put there every wet morning since she was 19. She was 23. She had 31 children on her book that spring, and 26 of them in the room by 9, because the Furlong boys were carting, and Betsy Crewe had the earache, and the 2 smallest Prater girls could not be spared from the wash. She taught them their letters and their figures and the catechism, and she taught them, which was not in her instructions from anybody, to say what they meant in a plain sentence, and to look a grown man in the face while they said it. For this she was paid £9 a year, and the use of the little room behind the schoolroom with the fireplace that smoked, and the £9 came out of the estate office at Ravensmere in 4 payments, and every one of those payments was counted out onto the office table by the hand of Sir Edmund Pell. That is the first thing to understand about the whole of this business, and everything that happened afterwards stands on it. Sir Edmund Pell, Baronet of Pell Court in the same county, was 46, and he had been the man of business of the Dukes of Ravensmere for 19 years, and since the 9th of January he had been rather more than that. The 8th Duke had died at Ravensmere on the 9th of January, with no son, no brother living, and no near cousin in that country at all, and from the 10th of January onward there had been nobody at Ravensmere above Sir Edmund Pell. He paid every wage on the estate. He appointed the men in the yard, and he turned them off again. He held the leases of 11 farms and the rents of 42 cottages, and he was chairman of the 4 trustees of the parish charities, which meant that the roof over Clara Bray's head, the fire in her grate, the £9 that bought her boots and her tea, and the school itself, sat inside his hand as neatly as a walnut sits in a nutcracker. He had never raised his voice to her in his life. He had never needed to. The note came up from the great house at 7:30 by the hand of a boy who ran and did not wait. It was 3 lines in the estate office clerk's copperplate, and it said that Sir Edmund Pell would receive her at the house at 11 upon a matter touching the school, and that she was to bring with her the slates, the copybooks of the whole school, the horn book, the register, and the key. It did not say why, and it did not say she might come the next day when the rain had gone by. Clara read it twice in the doorway, with the water running off the thatch behind her, then folded it into the pocket of her gown, and went in and heard the 2nd class say the 7 times table, because the children were coming up the lane. She let them out at 10. Tom Lissett, who was 11 and had a foot that turned in, and who was therefore always the last out of the room, stopped in the door and asked her whether she was in trouble. She said that she was going up to the house to see Sir Edmund. Tom Lissett said that his father said Sir Edmund was to have the school ground for the new kennels, because the new Duke would want 40 couple of hounds, and there was nowhere on the estate for them but the chantry piece, and his father had it from the man who was measuring. Clara Bray said that his father was a good carter and a poor prophet, and gave him the last of the bread out of her own cupboard, and watched him go down the lane in the wet with his shoulder dipping the way it did. Then she went in and tied the whole school up in a piece of sailcloth. It made a bundle that came to the middle of her chest, 31 slates, because she kept a slate for every child on the book, whether the child came or not, each framed in beech, and each frame rubbed smooth by 15 years of small hands. The copybooks on top of them, 4 and 20, in soft grey covers, with the children's names on the front, in her own writing, and their whole year inside. The horn book that had been her father's. The register in which the name of every child in that parish who had learned to read since the reign of the second George had been entered by somebody. And the key of the schoolroom door, 7 inches of black iron, which weighed more than the register. She roped the sailcloth twice round the whole of it, and got it up onto her hip. It is 2.5 miles from the chantry piece to the front of Ravensmere by the road, and the mill path that would have saved 1/2 mile was under water in April, and a wet copybook is a lost copybook. So she went by the road with the rain coming straight into her face, and the bundle riding on her hip, and she stopped 4 times to change the arm. She had one gown fit to be seen in, and she was wearing it, grey stuff, turned twice and patched at both elbows by her own hand, and by the lodge gates it weighed half as much again as it had in the schoolroom. Her boots were her father's, mended with twine at the left toe. She had no umbrella. Nobody in that parish, under the rank of a farmer, had an umbrella. Ravensmere stands on rising ground above its own lake, and it shows you the whole of its front for the last 1/2 mile of the drive, which is a thing the architect did on purpose. It is a house of 49 windows across the front, with a portico of 6 columns at the top of a flight of 11 stone steps, and on a wet April morning it is the colour of a peeled almond, and the rain runs off it in ropes. Clara Bray came up the drive at 5 minutes to 11, with the water standing in her boots and the sailcloth going dark, and she saw that there were carriages on the gravel. There was a travelling chariot with the wheels still steaming, and 2 grooms at the leaders, and a barouche and a gig. There were perhaps 14 people on the portico, under the shelter of the columns, because it is a pleasant thing on a wet morning to stand dry with your coffee and watch the weather happen to other people. She knew 4 by sight and 1 by name, and the one she knew by name was Miss Georgiana Pell, who was 20, who was Sir Edmund's brother's daughter, who had been at Ravensmere since the middle of March, and who stood at the top of the steps that morning, in white sprigged muslin, with an India shawl over her arms and her hair done in a way that had not yet reached that county. Clara Bray did not go up the steps. She had never in her life supposed that she might. She went along the gravel to the right, toward the door in the angle of the east front, where the estate business of Ravensmere had been done since anybody could remember, and she was halfway along the front of the house when the door under the portico opened, and Sir Edmund Pell came out onto the top step, with 2 of the gentlemen from the house party behind him, and saw her. He called her name across the gravel in a perfectly civil voice, and told her to come up. That was the first thing he did, and it was done with intention, because Sir Edmund Pell had spent 19 years learning exactly what a room can be made to do. And a house party standing dry under a portico at 11 in the morning is a room. She came up the 11 steps with the bundle on her hip and the rain coming off the end of her plait, and she stopped 3 steps from the top, because he did not move back to let her on to the level, and so she stood below him, with her face turned up, and the water on it, and every soul on that portico turned round to look, and the laughing went quiet the way laughing does when something better is coming. Sir Edmund Pell asked her, pleasantly, whether she had brought the whole of it. She said that she had. He asked whether she understood why she had been sent for. She said that she did not, and that she had left 26 children with no afternoon school in order to find out. One of the gentlemen behind him laughed at that, and Sir Edmund Pell did not, and the difference between those two facts was the difference between a man who was enjoying himself and a man who was working. He told her, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough to reach the last person under the portico, that the trustees of the parish charities had considered the state of the school upon the chantry piece, and that the endowment of the chantry piece was found to be of no present effect, and that the ground would be wanted before Midsummer for the new kennels and the huntsman's house, the new Duke of Ravensmere being a young man who would certainly hunt, and that in consequence there was no longer any provision in the estate for a schoolmistress, and no place, and no room, and no stipend. He said it in one breath in about 11 seconds, and he said the last part of it looking not at her but at the assembled company, which is how you can always tell what a speech is for. Clara Bray stood on the 3rd step down with 2.5 miles of rain in her clothes, and asked him, quite clearly, what was to become of the children. She should not have done it. She knew it while she was doing it. But it was the only question she had, and she had carried it 2.5 miles in the wet, and it came out of her the way water comes out of a gutter, whether the house is ready for it or not. Sir Edmund Pell looked at her for the first time that morning. Then he said, in the same civil voice, that there were no children, that there was a parish list of paupers' brats who might as well be at work, that a woman with no name, no money, and no friends had no business making speeches on his Grace's steps, and that if she wanted a thing to be sorry about, she might consider that she was, at that moment, dripping onto them. And then he put out his cane and swept the bundle out of her arms. He did it underhand and almost lazily, the way a man knocks a wasp off a plate, and the rope was wet, and the sailcloth was wet, and the whole of it went out of her arms at once, and into the air. The slates came out of the cloth as it opened. 31 slates in beech frames went out over the top step and down, and the copybooks went with them, and came apart in the wet as they fell, and the loose leaves of 26 children's year of work went up and sideways, and out over the balustrade in the rain. The register turned over twice in the air. The key rang on the stone. Nobody on that portico moved for about 2 seconds. Then Miss Georgiana Pell laughed, once high and delighted, with her hand not quite over her mouth, and 2 of the gentlemen laughed after her, because a laugh from a pretty girl is a permission, and a lady in a plum pelisse said "oh" in the voice people use at the theatre, and Clara Bray stood on the 3rd step with her hands still shut on nothing and her chin coming up. She did not cry. She has been asked about it since by people who had a right to ask, and she has always said the same thing, which is that she was too busy counting. 9 slates broken on the steps, 4 gone over the edge into the wet gravel, the register face down in a puddle with the parish's whole memory of itself soaking through it, and every leaf of every copybook going off across the drive in the rain in a way that meant that Betsy Crewe's year and Tom Lissett's year and the year of every child in that parish who had learned to write since the last Michaelmas was finished. She went down onto the steps after them. That was the thing the 14 people under the portico talked about at dinner that night, and told wrong. She went down on her knees on the wet stone in front of the whole house party and began to pick the slates up, and she did it without hurrying and without looking up, and she stacked them on her arm in the order she always stacked them, the little ones underneath. And at the bottom of the 11 steps, out in the rain where nobody had been standing a minute before, a man in a plain dark coat that had gone black with wet went down on one knee on the gravel and began to pick up the copybooks. He had come up the drive on foot, which was why nobody had seen him arrive. The whole of Ravensmere was trained to notice wheels. He had walked the last 9 miles from where the mail coach set him down at Aldenshaw Cross, carrying his own bag, and the bag stood behind him now on the gravel, with the rain beating on it. He was 29, tall, burnt brown to the collar, in the way of a man who has spent 11 years where the sun is honest about itself, with black hair cut short, and a white seam of an old scar under the left cheekbone. And his coat was good cloth 4 years out of fashion, and mended at the cuff by somebody who was not a tailor. He picked the copybooks up 2 and 3 at a time, and pressed the loose leaves back into them, and set them under his arm out of the wet, and went along the gravel after the ones the wind had taken, and did not once look up at the portico. His name was Adam Reday. He had been the 9th Duke of Ravensmere since 9 o'clock in the evening on the 9th of January, and there was not one living soul in the parish of Aldenshaw who knew it by sight. He had been sent away from that house at 9 years old when his mother died, to his mother's people in the north, and from there into the Navy at 13. And in the 20 years since he had been at Ravensmere exactly twice, both times as a boy, both times for under a week. The 8th Duke had not been a cruel uncle. He had simply been a man who was not interested. There was a portrait of Adam read at 9 years old in the small library, and it hung above the door, which is where a house puts a picture it does not intend to look at. He had come home in April rather than in January, and on foot for a reason any officer who has taken over a ship would understand. He wanted to see the thing before it saw him. He had written to Sir Edmund Pell from London to say that His Grace was detained until the summer, and then had taken the mail and walked, meaning to spend a fortnight in his own village, hearing what his own village said when it did not know who was listening. And he had been on his own gravel 4 minutes when he found out. He came up the steps with the copybooks under his coat. He came up past Clara Bray without stopping, and he went to the top, onto the level, in front of Sir Edmund Pell, dripping, with a stranger's bag standing out on the gravel behind him, and he asked, in a quiet voice, with a great deal of quarterdeck under it, whether the gentleman would be good enough to pick up the register. Sir Edmund Pell looked at him for rather a long moment, because he was not a fool, and there was something in the way the man stood that he did not care for. But the coat was 4 years old and mended, and the boots were a working man's boots, and the bag on the gravel was canvas, and Sir Edmund Pell had spent 19 years reading men off their clothes, and had never once, in his own estimation, been wrong. He asked who the devil he was. Adam Reedy said that his name was Reedy, that he had come to Aldenshaw looking for work, and that he had been told at the cross that the estate was taking men on for the new building. And Sir Edmund Pell, standing at the top of 11 steps in front of 14 guests, with his cane still in his hand, felt the room come back to him, and smiled, and said that the estate was indeed taking men on, and that a man who was so free with his opinions upon his first morning had better be free with his back as well, that he might report to the yard at 6 in the morning, that the wage was 2 shillings a day, and he would find the work at the mill-leat and afterwards at the kennels, and that if he ever again spoke to Sir Edmund Pell in that manner, he would be off the estate inside the hour. Adam Ready said that he was obliged to him. Then he went back down the 11 steps in the rain, and knelt on the gravel, and picked the register out of the puddle, and dried the cover of it on the inside of his own shirt, which was the only dry cloth in the county at that moment, and gave it to the young woman kneeling on the steps. She looked at him properly for the first time then. She said that his shirt was ruined. He said that it had been ruined before and by worse. She asked him whether he had heard what had been said to her. He said that everybody within 100 yards had heard what had been said to her, and that they had been meant to. Clara Bray got up off her knees with the register against her chest and 31 slates, 9 of them cracked, stacked on her forearm, and she looked up the 11 steps at the portico where nobody was laughing any more, because it had gone on too long to be funny. And then she looked at the man beside her, who was carrying 26 children's copybooks inside his coat, and she said that she did not know him. He said that she did not. She said that in that case he had just spent his first morning in the county making an enemy of the only man in it who mattered, over a bundle of slates belonging to a woman who could not pay him for it in anything at all. He said that he had noticed that, and Clara Bray, standing in the rain on the 11th of April, with everything she had in the world broken on the steps behind her, laughed. It was not much of a laugh, and it did not last. But it was the first sound of any kind she made after Sir Edmund Pell put out his cane, and Miss Georgiana Pell heard it from the top of the steps, and did not care for it. And neither did her uncle. And there are people in that county who will tell you that the whole of the rest of this story came out of it. They walked down the drive together in the rain, the pair of them, with the slates and the copybooks divided between them, and the 14 guests went in to the fire. He carried the slates the whole 2.5 miles, and she stopped offering to take them after the second refusal, because she saw that he was doing it the way a man does a thing he has decided about. She asked whether he was a seafaring man, and he said that he had been. She asked what ship, and he said several, and named none, and she let it alone. At the chantry piece she opened the door with the black iron key, and he set the slates down on the long desk under the window, and looked round the schoolroom. And Clara Bray watched him do it. It was one room, with a flagged floor and a roof of oak raised in 1684 4 long desks. A stove that did not draw, the alphabet in her own hand on a board along the north wall, a shelf with 9 books on it, and above the door, cut into the stone lintel by somebody who had been paid to do it properly, the sentence that Eleanor, 3rd Duchess of Ravensmere, had ordered cut there, for the teaching of the poor children of this parish forever. He stood and read the lintel for a while. Then he asked her who Eleanor had been. Clara Bray told him that she had been a Duchess of Ravensmere who had come out of a shop in Norwich, which everybody in the parish knew, and nobody at the great house mentioned, and who had given the chantry piece and the schoolroom and £40 a year out of her own settlement so that the children of the estate should be taught, and who had put that sentence over the door because she had been told once too often that it was not the business of such people to read. Adam Reed asked what had become of the £40 a year, and Clara Bray, who was hanging her father's boots by the stove, and had no reason on earth to be careful in front of a labourer, who had been in the county 2 hours, said that the £40 a year had become 9 at some time before she was born, that the difference had gone somewhere she could not see into, that the trustees were Sir Edmund Pell, the Reverend Josiah Cade, who was Sir Edmund Pell's curate, in everything but the paying of him, a farmer at Long Bewley, who held his farm from Sir Edmund Pell, and the Duke of Ravensmere, who had never in the history of the world attended a meeting of them, and that she had written twice to the Duke of Ravensmere in London, in her best hand, on paper she could not afford, and had never had a line back, and that in her opinion, a man who could not be troubled to answer a letter about the children on his own land was not likely to be troubled by anything else about them either. She said it with her back to him, wringing the rain out of her plait into the ash bucket. Adam Reed stood in the middle of the schoolroom with his hands behind him and said nothing at all for a moment. Then he said that perhaps the letters had never reached him. Clara Bray said that a man with 49 windows could afford a clerk who opened his post. He said that was true. He said it in a voice that she thought at the time was agreement, and that she understood a great deal better afterwards. Then he asked her whether the school would go on. She said that it would go on until somebody came and pulled the roof off it, because Eleanor's £40 had bought a lintel, and Sir Edmund Pell's £9 had only ever bought her boots, and she could teach without boots. He asked what the date was for the kennels. She said Midsummer. He asked her what she would do at Midsummer. She said that she had no idea whatever, and that she had been trying not to find out. He was at the mill leat at 6 the next morning. The leat at Aldenshaw carries the water from the weir above the church down to the mill wheel, and it runs for the last 200 yards along the bottom of the chantry piece, 4 feet below the schoolroom windows, between 2 walls of dressed stone laid in the reign of Queen Anne. 11 perches of the north wall had gone out into the water in the February floods. Sir Edmund Pell put 4 men onto it, and by the end of the first week 3 of them had been taken off for the kennels, and the wall was left to the new man, which is the oldest arrangement in the world, and everybody understood it perfectly. So Adam Reed worked 11 perches of wall alone, in the water, from 6 in the morning until the light went, for 2 shillings a day, 4 feet below the schoolroom window, and 30 feet from the door, from the 12th of April until the 2nd of June. Clara Bray taught 26 children 11 yards away from him. For the whole of that time, she had the window open from the first week in May, and so the school and the wall went on side by side all that spring within hearing of one another. He heard the 7 times table, and the catechism, and the whole of the Book of Ruth read aloud by Betsy Crewe at 7 years old, in a voice like a gate hinge. He heard Clara Bray tell Ned Furlong that a boy who could not spell his own village had no business laughing at anybody, and heard her tell a child 3 times in the first fortnight that there was nothing whatever the matter with being poor, and a great deal the matter with being ignorant, and that the second one could be cured. She fed him from the second day, and it was not a kindness she made anything of, because there is nothing so ordinary in a poor parish as feeding a man working near your door. At noon she put a cup of milk and a piece of bread on the flat stone by the corner of the wall, and went back in. After the first week he came and sat in the doorway instead, and after the second week the children ate their own bread on the step beside him and asked him questions. He answered about a third of them. He would tell them about a whale off the Western Islands and about ice on the rigging in the Baltic thick enough to bring a ship's head down. He would not tell them where he came from, or what he had been, or why a labourer at 2 shillings a day spoke the way he spoke. Tom Lisset, who was 11 and lame and therefore had a great deal of time for watching people, told Clara Bray in the 3rd week of May that Mr. Reed was hiding from somebody, and Clara Bray told him not to be foolish, and then thought about it for a fortnight, because he did speak the way he spoke, and that was the thing she came back to. She had been the schoolmistress of that parish for 4 years, and the schoolmaster's daughter for 19 before it, and she knew every voice within 9 miles, and his was not one of them. And he read. She found that out in the last week of April, when she came in from the pump, and found him at her shelf of 9 books, with the Herodotus open on his hand, and he put it back with the guilty speed of a man caught at something, and she asked him whether he could read Greek, and he said that he had been made to, once, a long time ago, by a person who was paid for it. She should have known then, and she has said so since. But that county was full of men who had been officers in the war and were nothing at all now. Half pay stopped and ships sold out of the service, and any one of them might have had Greek and a mended cuff, and Clara Bray had more sense than to ask a ruined gentleman what he had been before he was ruined. So she taught him instead. He said, in the 1st week of May, sitting in the schoolroom doorway with his boots off and his feet in the leat, that his hand was a disgrace, and that he had never written a fair line in his life, which was a lie, and one of the very few he told her. She said that if he came in of an evening she would set him copies. And he came, 3 evenings a week and then 4, and sat at the second desk with his knees up under it like a great boy, and Clara Bray stood over him with her arms folded and told him that his letters leaned like a man in a gale, and he laughed and did them again. It is worth saying plainly what those evenings were, because the parish afterwards said something else. There was a stove that smoked and 1 candle, and the door stood open onto the chantry piece until the light went at 9, and after that it stood open still. He asked her what she would do if the school were hers to run and nobody could interfere with her, and she told him, at a length that surprised her afterwards, that she would have a 2nd room for the little ones, and a stove that drew, and books, and that she would take the girls as far as the boys, because she had never once been shown a reason why not. He asked what she would need. She said £40 a year and a person above her who would not take it away again, and that of the 2 the 2nd was much the harder to come by. He asked her once about her father. Her father had been schoolmaster on the chantry piece for 32 years, a clever man and a poor one, and had died in the winter of 1815 of a thing that starts in the chest and finishes there, and the trustees had let her keep the school, because it was the middle of a term, and there was nobody else. and had gone on letting her keep it for 4 years on £9 a year because they had discovered that a woman could be paid less. She said it without any bitterness at all, which is a good deal harder than saying it with some. He asked her whether she had never thought of going. She said that she had thought of it every January. He asked why she stayed. She said because she had the names of every child in that parish since the reign of the second George in a book in her cupboard, and 31 of them were hers, and she had no notion who else would want them. And Adam Reed sat in a smoking schoolroom in a labourer's coat, with a ring on a bootlace under his shirt, and 49 windows 2.5 miles up the road that belonged to him, and did not tell her. He did not tell her for a reason that was perfectly good in April and got worse every week afterwards. He had come to Aldershot to hear the truth, and the moment he said his name, he would never hear a true word in that parish again as long as he lived. He would say it at Midsummer publicly, in a way that would make Sir Edmund Pell wish he had never been born. What he had not calculated for was that by the end of May he would be unable to eat his dinner for thinking about a schoolmistress in a turned grey gown, who had knelt on a wet step in front of 14 people and counted her broken slates instead of crying. Sir Edmund Pell noticed the evenings before either of them did. He had a nephew of the housekeeper's in the yard who told him things for sixpence, and by the middle of May he knew that the new man on the leat was in the schoolroom 4 nights a week, and that the candle burned past 9, and he considered the fact with the pleasure of a man who has been handed a tool he did not have to pay for. It must be understood that Sir Edmund Pell had a difficulty that spring, and the difficulty was Midsummer. The new Duke was to be presented to the county on Midsummer Day, and Sir Edmund Pell had spent 4 months arranging a Ravensmere for him to come down to. The kennels were part of it. A young Duke wants hounds, and a man who has built him his kennels before he asks for them is a man who is kept on. Miss Georgiana Pell was rather more than part of it, and the room she had been given since March was not the room a steward's niece is given, and Sir Edmund Pell had begun to say the word Duchess to himself in the evenings, the way a man tries on a coat. And the last part of it was the accounts of the parish charities of Aldershot, in his hands for 19 years, in which the difference between £40 and 9 had been going somewhere for the whole of that time. A woman who had written twice to the Duke of Ravensmere about that school was therefore not a nuisance. She was a danger, and she had now been seen by 2 men in the yard, walking down the drive in the rain, with a labourer, and laughing. The trustees of the parish charities of Aldershot met in the vestry of St. Wiston's Church on the 5th of May at 11 in the morning, and Clara Bray was required to attend. The vestry at Aldershot is a stone room 12 feet square with a coffin stool, a chest, a table and 1 window at the height of a tall man's shoulder, and there were 9 people in it that morning, the 4 trustees, being Sir Edmund Pell, the Reverend Josiah Cade, Mr. Whip of Long Bewley, and an empty chair for the Duke of Ravensmere, the 2 churchwardens, the parish clerk, Miss Georgiana Pell, who had no business there whatever, and had come because her uncle asked her to, and Clara Bray, who stood, because she was not offered the stool. Sir Edmund Pell did not accuse her of anything, which is the part that people who have never been poor find hardest to follow. He merely observed, as chairman, that a question had been raised, and that he was sure it was nothing, and that it was his painful duty to put it. Was it the case that a man not of that parish, name, of Redede, a labourer, was in the habit of remaining in the schoolroom after dark? Clara Bray said that it was. Was there any person present on those occasions besides the said Reed and herself? Clara Bray said that there was not. The Reverend Josiah Cade said that he was very sorry indeed to hear it. Miss Georgiana Pell said, to nobody in particular, that she had seen it herself from the carriage, and that the candle was burning at 9:30, and that, of course, one did not like to say anything. And Sir Edmund Pell said that the trustees were not sitting in judgment upon anybody's character, that no charge whatever was made, that he was certain, personally, that there was nothing in it, but that a schoolmistress in an endowed school stands in the place of a parent to the children of the parish, and that where a doubt exists, the doubt itself is the injury, and that the trustees would be failing in their duty if they did not record their concern in the minute book. Clara Bray listened to the whole of it standing on a stone floor with her hands at her sides. And when he had finished, she asked to say one thing. And Sir Edmund Pell, who could afford to be generous in a room of 9, allowed it. She said that she had been born in that parish, that she had taught its children for 4 years, and that there was not a house within 3 miles that did not know her. She said that the man Ray had mended the roof of the schoolroom on a Sunday for nothing, and had carried her slates 2.5 miles, and had never once been alone in that room with a shut door in his life, and that if any person in the vestry wished to say otherwise, they might say it out loud and put their name to it in the book, which was what the book was for. Nobody did. That is exactly the point of the manoeuvre, and Sir Edmund Pell had performed it a great many times. Nothing is said, nothing is written, nothing can be answered, and the smell of it stays in the parish for 11 years. The minute was recorded in the words the chairman had used. The meeting closed at 10 minutes before 12, and Adam Redday was standing outside the vestry door, in the churchyard, in his working clothes, with mortar dust to the elbow, because Tom Lissett had come down to the Leet at 11:15 and told him where she was. He was 3 feet from the door when it opened. He had heard the last of it through a stone window at the height of a tall man's shoulder, and Clara Bray came out into the churchyard and saw his face, and knew, before he had said one word, exactly what he was about to do, and she took hold of the front of his coat with both hands, which was a thing she had never done in her life to any man, and stopped him in the middle of the path. He said that he would put an end to it in about 11 seconds. She said that he would not. She said, with the trustees coming out of the door behind her one at a time, that whatever he had been before he came to Aldenshaw, he was now a man at 2 shillings a day, with 1 coat. And that if he went into that vestry and called Sir Edmund Pell what Sir Edmund Pell was, he would be off the estate by dinner and on the road with a character that would follow him into the next county, and that she had already lost the school, and would not also be the reason he lost the only work he had. Her voice went at this point, and she was extremely angry with it for going. "You have nothing," she said. "Do not spend it on me." Adam Ray stood in the churchyard of St. Wystan, with the Reverend Josiah Cade going past his shoulder, and looked down at the 2 hands holding the front of his coat. Then he said, very quietly, that she had that the wrong way about, and he took her hands off his coat one at a time and held them for rather longer than the operation required. And he went back to the Leet and laid 11 feet of wall that afternoon, and said nothing to anybody, and Sir Edmund Pell rode past the chantry piece at 4 o'clock and saw him at it, and was satisfied. The ring came out on the 20th of May in the estate yard at Ravensmere, at 5:30 in the afternoon, in front of about 40 people. He wore it on a bootlace round his neck, under his shirt, and had worn it there since he was 19. It was a thin gold hoop, worn nearly flat on the inside, set with one dark garnet in a plain rubbed collet. And it had been his mother's, and it was the only thing he had out of that house. On the 20th of May, the yard was carting stone for the kennel footings, and Adam Reed was in the pit loading it with his shirt open, and when he came up the ramp with a stone on his shoulder, the lace swung out, and the ring came out with it and hung in the light. Miss Georgiana Pell was in the yard, because the yard was on the way to the stables, and she rode at 6. She saw it from 11 feet away. She stopped, and she looked at it for about 4 seconds, and then she said, in a voice that carried the whole length of the yard, that she would like to know where a labourer got a lady's ring. Everything that followed took 9 minutes. Adam Reed put the stone down and said that the ring was his. Miss Georgiana Pell said that she had seen that ring before, and said it with such confidence that 3 men afterwards swore she had. She had not, and she was not lying either. She had seen a ring like it in an inventory of the Ravensmere jewels which her uncle let her read in March. And by the time the words were out of her mouth, she believed them entirely. She said that there had been a robbery at the great house in the winter. There had not. She said that the man had been in the county since April, and nobody knew a thing about him. Sir Edmund Pell came out of the estate office at that point. He had been at the window for a minute and a half. He asked to see the ring. Adam Reedy said no. He said it in the flat voice of a man who has given an order at sea, and it was the wrong voice entirely for a labourer in a stone yard, and every man in the yard heard the difference, and Sir Edmund Pell heard it best of all and turned it at once into the case against him. A man who will not show a thing has a reason. A man who speaks like that and works for 2 shillings is running from something. Send for Bevis Alder the constable. Nobody is accusing anybody. We shall simply have the ring looked at by somebody who knows the house. And Adam Reed stood in the middle of his own stone yard, 500 yards from his own front door, and understood that he was 9 minutes from either being taken up before a magistrate as a thief or saying his own name, and that if he said his own name in that yard in a torn shirt to save himself from a girl in a riding habit, then the whole of what he had come to Aldenshaw to do was finished, and Sir Edmund Pell would have 4 weeks to arrange the truth before Midsummer. He said nothing. He said nothing for rather a long time, and the yard began to fill up, and the men who had been carting with him all afternoon began, in the way of men, to move slightly apart from him. Clara Bray came into the yard at 20 minutes to 6. She had come up for the quarter's stipend which was not going to be paid, and she had walked the 2.5 miles in the heat, and she came in at the gate and found 40 people in a half circle and a constable being sent for, and she asked the nearest woman what was happening, and was told. What she did next was done in front of the whole estate, and is the reason a good many people in that parish would afterwards have gone into fire for her. She walked into the middle of the yard, which no woman of her condition had any business doing, and she said, loudly enough to reach the office door, that the ring had been round that man's neck on the 11th of April, when he came into the county, and that she had seen it herself. There was a silence of the particular kind that follows a fact. Sir Edmund Pell asked her, very civilly, whether she was aware of what she was saying. She said that she was. He asked where she had seen it. And Clara Bray, standing in the estate yard in a patched grey gown with 40 people looking at her, said that she had seen it on the 11th of April, when the man took his shirt off the shoulder to dry the parish register on it, because Sir Edmund Pell had knocked the register into a puddle on the front steps of the great house, in front of 14 of the Duke's guests, and that she should be glad if the trustees would enter that in their minute book as well. Miss Georgiana Pell went the colour of her own habit. 2 of the carters laughed and turned it into coughing, and Sir Edmund Pell, who was a man of considerable ability and had just been publicly cut across the face with a fact in front of his own labour force, did the only thing that was left to him, which was to smile, and say that the matter was plainly a misunderstanding of his niece's, and that he was glad it was cleared up, and that there was no more to be said, and everyone might go about their business. Then he went into the estate office and stood at the window and watched the schoolmistress of the chantry piece walk out of his yard beside a labourer, and he made up his mind about her in a way that he had not entirely made it up before. She had ruined herself twice over and did not know it. A woman already under a whisper from her own trustees does not stand up in a yard of 40 men and swear to what she has seen on the bare shoulder of a labourer she is alone, with 4 evenings a week. Sir Edmund Pell did not have to invent anything after the 20th of May. He merely had to repeat, in 11 houses, with regret, what everybody in the yard had heard her say herself. On the road home, Adam Reed did not speak for half a mile. Then he asked her whether she had any idea what she had just done to herself, and Clara Bray said that she had a very fair idea. That a man was going to be taken up for a thief in front of 40 people, for a thing she knew to be false, and there was one person in the county who could stop it, and the price of stopping it was her own good name, and that a good name you will not spend is not a good name, but a savings box. He stopped in the road. He said her name, which he had not used before. He began to tell her. He got as far as saying that there was something she was owed, and that he had had no right to be in her schoolroom for 6 weeks without saying it, and that when she heard it, she would very likely never speak to him again. And at exactly that moment, the Aldenshaw carrier's cart came round the bend with 4 people on it, and Mrs. Prater called out to ask after Betsy Crewe's earache, and by the time it had gone by, the thing had gone out of him. What he said instead was that he would tell her at Midsummer, and that she was to remember. Whatever happened before then, that he had meant to tell her in a road in May, with mortar on his hands. Clara Bray said that if he was married, she would rather hear it now. He said that he was not married. She said that in that case it would keep, and she walked on, and neither of them said anything else until the church, and both of them thought about it for the whole of the next 5 weeks. Mrs. Hannah Sowerby had been housekeeper at Ravensmere for 31 years, and she found him out on the 24th of May, at the back door of the great house, over a can of small beer. She was 61, and she had been an upper housemaid in the year the 8th Duke's sister brought her boy home from the north for 6 days at Christmas, and she had a memory of the kind that servants of that generation had, which is to say, a complete one. What she recognized was not the face. It was that he thanked her, and the way he stood while he did it, and one word he called the beer sharp, which is what his mother had called it, being a Norfolk woman, and Mrs. Sowerby had not heard anybody say it in 30 years. She put the can down on the step and looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, quite steadily, that she had better be told at once whether she was to call him sir. He took her into the still room and shut the door and told her the whole of it in about 4 minutes. Mrs. Sowerby heard him out, and then sat down on the flour bin, which she had not done in 31 years of service, and told him what she thought of it, which took rather longer. She told him that a man who lets a house lie to him for 6 weeks will hear a great deal of truth, and will also do a great deal of harm. That there was a young woman in that parish whose character was being taken to pieces in 11 drawing rooms at that moment on account of him, and that if his Grace intended to go on carrying stone in his own yard until midsummer, he had better at least eat properly, and she would see that a dinner went down to the Leet. He asked her for 4 weeks. She gave him 3, and then gave him the 4th anyway, and she never told a living soul until the 24th of June, and there are people in that county who still say that the person who really won that summer was the housekeeper. The letter came on the 2nd of June. It came by a London messenger to the Aldenshaw Cross Inn at 7 in the morning, addressed to A. Reed, Esquire, and Adam Reed read it standing in 4 inches of water, with the trowel still in his hand. It was from the solicitors of the estate in Lincoln's Inn. The writ of summons to the House of Lords had come, and his attendance in London was required upon the 8th of June, and not late. The settlement upon the parish charities of Aldenshaw, which his Grace had directed them to prepare, awaited his signature, and they would be obliged to know his Grace's pleasure regarding the accounts of the trustees of those charities for the past 19 years, of which they had now obtained the whole, and had certain observations to make. He was on the road to London within 4 hours. He had time to do 3 things, and he did them in this order. He went to the chantry piece and found the schoolroom full, and did not go in, and stood at the window in the sun for 1.5 minutes while she was hearing the 4th class, and then he wrote 7 words on the back of the solicitor's cover in pencil, and put it through the open window onto her desk, and the 7 words were, "Called to London. Back by midsummer. Wait." He went to the great house and told Mrs. Sowerby to have a particular room opened and aired by the 23rd of June, and to say nothing. And he stopped in the yard on his way out, and stood for a moment looking at the kennel footings, which were up to 3 courses, and then he went. Clara Bray found the paper on her desk at noon with the sun on it. She read it perhaps 40 times in the first week. She did not doubt it in the first week at all. She was too busy. She had the school to keep going with the trustee's notice hanging over it, and Betsy Crewe's mother was brought to bed on the 4th of June, and the whole parish knew by then what the vestry had written in its book on the 5th of May, and what the yard had heard her say on the 20th. And there were 4 houses in Aldenshaw that summer where a woman turned her shoulder when Clara Bray came past. It was in the 2nd week that Sir Edmund Pell came to the schoolroom. He came alone, on foot, on the 10th of June, and he did not come in. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and was extremely pleasant, and said that he had come to tell her himself rather than let her hear it from the parish. The man Redday had left the estate on the 2nd of June, without giving notice, and without collecting 3 days' wages. A man who leaves 3 days' wages behind him, he said, is a man who is either frightened or paid, and in his own experience it was generally the second. He said that he had no wish to distress her, and that he would say only this, that in his 19 years he had known a good many young women in a small parish be very kind to a man who came from nowhere and had nothing, and that he had never yet known one of them see him again. Then he put on his hat and said that the trustees would sit upon the school on the 19th of the month, that the ground was wanted by Midsummer, and that he hoped she would not make it necessary for anybody to be unpleasant. Then he walked back down the lane in the sun, and Clara Bray stood in her own doorway and found that the worst of it was not one word he had said, but that she could not prove a single one of them wrong. The trustees of the parish charities of Aldenshaw sat in the vestry of St. Wiston on the 19th of June, and did in 11 minutes the thing they had been coming to since February. They found that the endowment of the school upon the chantry piece was charged upon lands since taken into the demesne of the Duke of Ravensmere, that the trustees had for many years maintained the school out of the estate's own charity, and not out of any enforceable fund, that the estate now required the ground, and that the school would close upon Midsummer Day, the 24th of June, at which day the mistress would deliver up the key and remove herself and her effects. Mr. Whip of Long Bewley, who held his farm from Sir Edmund Pell, seconded it. The Reverend Josiah Cade said that it was a melancholy necessity. The chair for the Duke of Ravensmere stood empty, as it had at every meeting within living memory. Clara Bray was not required to attend, and was not told until the next morning, when the parish clerk brought her the notice on his way to the smithy, and would not look at her while she read it. She kept the school open for 4 more days, which is a small thing, and is the thing the children remember. She had 26 on the Monday, and 30 on the Tuesday, because mothers who had turned their shoulders in the street sent their children up the lane all the same, which tells you something about that parish that the drawing rooms did not know. On the Wednesday, she gave out the 9 books off her shelf to the 9 children she thought would keep them, and wrote in the front of each one, in her own hand, the child's name and the words cut in the lintel over the door. The men came for the roof on the 23rd of June at 7 in the morning. There were 9 of them, and they were not unkind. They were estate men, and half of them had been taught to read in that room, and Bevis Alder the constable came with them, because Sir Edmund Pell had thought it possible there would be a crowd, and there was, and it did nothing at all, except stand in the chantry piece and watch. They took the tiles off first, in courses, and stacked them, because good tile is money. Then they took the oak, 7 bays of it, raised in 1684 by a duchess who came out of a shop in Norwich, and when the last principal went over, the whole parish, standing in the field, made a sound that was not a word. Clara Bray had the desks out on the grass by then, and the register under her arm. She had asked one thing of the foreman, and he had given it to her without going to anybody, that they should not touch the lintel. So the walls stood, and the door stood, and over the door the stone still said what it had said for 135 years, and there was nothing but sky behind it. She slept that night in the loft over Prater's mill, which the Praters gave her because Praters 3 had been in her school, and she had 2 boxes and a chair, and her father's horn book, and 31 slates with 9 cracked, and the black iron key in the pocket of her gown. Nothing had come from London. 3 weeks and a day. She had heard nothing since 7 words in pencil on the 2nd of June, and by Midsummer Eve she had done what a sensible woman of 23 does with a thing like that. She had taken it out, and looked at it, and put it away, and told herself that Sir Edmund Pell had very likely been right, and had not believed that either, and had lain in the mill loft on Midsummer Eve, listening to the wheel, and thinking about a man standing in 4 inches of water with a trowel in his hand, telling her that she had it the wrong way about. Midsummer Day at Ravensmere began at 6 in the morning, with 411 people being fed. That was Sir Edmund Pell's arrangement, and it was a good one. There were trestles down the whole length of the south lawn for the tenantry, and an ox, and 11 barrels, and a band from the county town. At 2 o'clock the county itself was to come, 44 carriages of it. At 3 the 9th Duke of Ravensmere was to arrive from London, and be presented to his people on the terrace, with the Lord Lieutenant beside him. And at 4 there was to be a public breakfast, at which the health of his Grace would be given by Sir Edmund Pell, who had written it out in full on the 14th of June, and had it in his breast pocket. Miss Georgiana Pell had a gown from London that had cost £111, and was to be presented second, after the Lord Lieutenant's lady. And at noon on Midsummer Day, while the band was playing on the south lawn, Clara Bray walked 2.5 miles up the Ravensmere Road in a turned grey gown, with a black iron key in her hand and 31 slates roped on a borrowed barrow, because the notice of the trustees said that the mistress would deliver up the key upon Midsummer Day, and she was not going to be told twice, and she was not going to send it. She did not go to the front. She went to the estate yard where such things are done, and there were perhaps 60 people in it. Carters, the kennel men, 4 tradesmen from the county town with bills, the band's carrier, a man with ice. She asked the clerk in the office window for Sir Edmund Pell, and was told he was on the terrace and could not be spoken to, and she said that she would wait, and she stood the barrow against the wall and waited 1 hour and 10 minutes in the sun. Sir Edmund Pell came into the yard at 20 minutes past 1 to see the ice. He saw her at once, and he was for about 4 seconds extremely angry, because a schoolmistress with a barrow of slates in his yard on Midsummer Day was untidiness, and then he thought better of it, in the way of a man who cannot bear to leave a thing unfinished, and he came across the yard with 2 of the county gentlemen, who had walked round with him and his niece on his arm in 111 pounds of London gown, and he stood in front of Clara Bray in the middle of 60 people and finished it. He took the key out of her hand. He did not take it from her palm. He took it out of her fingers with 2 of his own, and he held it up, and he said, in the pleasant carrying voice, that this was the schoolmistress of the chantry piece, of whom the gentleman had heard, that the trustees had been obliged to close her school, that she had made a great deal of noise in the parish about it, and had been very ill advised in her acquaintance, and that she would oblige him by being off the estate by dark, since his Grace was expected at 3, and there was no part of the day's arrangements in which she appeared. Then he gave the key to the clerk in the office window without looking at her again. Miss Georgiana Pell laughed. It was the same laugh it had been on the 11th of April on the portico, and it did the same thing to the yard, and one of the county gentlemen said something behind his hand, and the other one smiled at the ground, and the carters looked at their boots, and the man with the ice went on with the ice. Clara Bray stood in the estate yard of Ravensmere with nothing in her hands at all. She has said since that she cannot remember what she thought, and that what she chiefly remembers is deciding not to go out by the back way. She took hold of the barrow and turned it and pushed it out of the estate yard and along the front of the house, on the gravel, under the 49 windows, on Midsummer Day, in front of 44 carriages and the whole county of that part of England, because the drive was the shortest way to the gate. She was about level with the fourth column of the portico when the wheels came up the drive behind her. There were outriders and 4 horses, and a travelling chariot with the panels washed of dust at the lodge, and 44 carriages emptied themselves onto the terrace, and the Lord Lieutenant of the county came down 2 steps and stopped at the correct one, and Sir Edmund Pell came out of the great door at a speed that was very nearly running, and got himself to the top of the 11 steps with his hat off and his speech in his breast pocket, and Miss Georgiana Pell was placed, by her uncle's hand on her elbow, in the second position on his right. Clara Bray stood on the gravel at the bottom with a barrow of slates because there was nowhere else to be. The steps were let down, and the man who came out of the carriage and stood on the gravel in the sun was 29 and burnt brown to the collar, and had a white seam of an old scar under his left cheekbone, and was wearing a plain dark coat that was good cloth and 4 years out of fashion, and he had a canvas bag in his own hand. There is a particular silence that 400 people make. It is not the same as no noise. It came down the terrace from the top step to the bottom in about 3 seconds, and it went along the front of the house and out over the lawn, and the band stopped in the middle of the bar and did not start again. The Lord Lieutenant came down the last 2 steps and bowed, and said his Grace was very welcome home. Sir Edmund Pell stood at the top of 11 steps, with his hat in one hand, and his speech in his breast pocket, and did not move, and did not speak, and the colour went out of his face from the jaw upward, in a way that the 2 county gentlemen who had walked round the yard with him at 20 minutes past 1 both afterwards, described in almost the same words. He had knocked that man's arm off a bundle of slates on those steps on the 11th of April. He had put him in the Leet at 2 shillings a day. He had sent for the constable to have him taken up for a thief in his own yard on the 20th of May. He had told 11 houses that the fellow was a paid runaway. Every one of those things had been done in front of witnesses, and every one of the witnesses was standing on that terrace. Adam Reed gave the canvas bag to a footman, and went up the steps, and did what was required of him. The Lord Lieutenant, the Lord Lieutenant's lady, the member for the county, the Archdeacon, name after name after name. When he came to Sir Edmund Pell, he stopped, and looked at him, and said, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough to reach the last person on the terrace, that they had met before, on those steps, in the rain, on the 11th of April, and that he had asked Sir Edmund at that time to pick up a book out of a puddle, and that the solicitors of the estate had lately been through the accounts of the parish charities for 19 years, and would wait upon him in the morning. Then he passed on to Miss Georgiana Pell, who curtsied to the ground, and to whom he said nothing whatever. And then he came back down the 11 steps. He came down them in front of the Lord Lieutenant of the county, and 411 of his own tenantry, and the whole of the terrace. And he crossed 9 yards of his own gravel, and he stopped in front of a schoolmistress, in a turned grey gown, standing behind a barrow of 31 slates, and he took his hat off to her, which is a thing no man in that county had done in her life. Clara Bray said, and it was heard by everybody standing within 20 feet, "You might have told me." Adam Ree said that he had meant to, in a road in May, with mortar on his hands, and that he had lost his nerve, and that it was the only thing he had lost his nerve over in 11 years, and that he intended to spend a considerable time being reminded of it. Then he took a bootlace out of his breast and untied the knot in it with his fingers in front of 400 people, and took off it a thin gold hoop, worn nearly flat on the inside, with one dark garnet in a rubbed collet, which had been his mother's, and which was the only thing he had ever had out of that house, and he took Clara Bray's hand, which had mortar dust and slate dust, and 21 years of chalk in the creases of it, and he asked her, out loud on the gravel, in front of Sir Edmund Pell, whether she would have him. She was a long time answering, long enough for the whole terrace to hear a rook go over, and what she said was yes, and then she said his name, which was the only name she had for him, and the wrong one, and he answered to it. He put the ring on her finger on the gravel at 10 minutes past 3 on Midsummer Day. The Lord Lieutenant's lady curtsied first, from the 4th step, because she was 70 and had seen 4 reigns and knew what she was looking at before anybody else on that terrace did. Then the county went down like corn. 44 carriages of people who had been told at dinner in April about the schoolmistress who knelt on the steps, and had laughed about the candle burning at 9:30, and had turned a shoulder in the street, went down onto the gravel and the stone in one long ragged movement, and the 411 on the south lawn came round the corner of the house at a run, and saw it, and took their hats off, and somebody down there began to shout, and it went along the whole front of the house. Miss Georgiana Pell curtsied in 111 pounds of London gown to the schoolmistress of the chantry piece. And Sir Edmund Pell stood alone at the top of 11 stone steps above all of it, with his hat in his hand, and the health of his grace written out in full in his breast pocket, and watched. The children came up the drive at 3:30. They came because the whole parish was coming, and they came in a lump the way children do. And Tom Lissett was last because of his foot, and Clara Bray went down the drive to meet them with the ring on her hand, and knelt on the gravel in front of the lot of them in her turned grey gown, and let them get at her. She was married to Adam Reed, 9th Duke of Ravensmere, in the church of St. Wystan at Aldenshaw on the 14th of September, with 31 children in the 2 front pews on the north side, and the doors standing open into the churchyard, because the church would not hold what came. Mrs. Hannah Sowerby gave her away, at her own request, which caused a certain amount of comment in the county, and none whatever in the village. The schoolroom was roofed again in oak in the autumn, with a second room built onto the west end for the little ones, and a stove that drew. The kennel footings were taken up. Sir Edmund Pell left the county in November. The Reverend Josiah Cade stayed and was extremely attentive, and was never once asked to dine. But that is not the end of it, and the parish has never told it that way. The way the parish tells it, it ends on the gravel at 10 minutes past 3 on Midsummer Day, with the band stopped in the middle of a bar, and a barrow of 31 slates standing where she had left go of it, and a girl in a patched grey gown who had been told at 20 minutes past 1 to be off the estate by dark. Looking at a man who had knelt in the rain on the 11th of April to pick her copybooks out of a puddle, and finding out 3 months late and in front of the whole county exactly who it was, who had been sitting at the second desk with his knees up under it, letting her tell him that his letters leaned like a man in a gale.